And to talk more about this particular story, we are joined by Kokkie Kooyman, who is a director at Denker Capital. There are a lot of movements around the world when it comes to currencies, and the rand is among the worst performing currencies in the world in terms of emerging markets right now. Mr. Kooyman, thank you very much for joining us this evening. What's eating the rand? We know that there are central bank decisions that we are waiting from the UK and the US. What's actually eating the rand so much this year?
Yeah, no, you're right. I think there are two things, as I just said. The one is central bank decisions, and you're right, we're waiting for the UK. Actually, Switzerland is also on Thursday going to hike interest rates, and the Swedish central bank hiked interest rates yesterday, actually by 75 basis points. So we are seeing this everywhere, and it's largely due to the very loose monetary policy followed post-COVID, and then the strong economic recovery worldwide, and that has just put huge pressure on supply. There's too much demand and not enough supply, and that's caused inflation. Initially, most central banks thought that the supply issues or that the inflation pressures will be temporary, or transitionary was the word they used, and inflation will quickly come down. But with inflation, as we're seeing with labor wants to be compensated for the higher cost of living, and then inflation becomes endemic. And that's why central banks everywhere are starting to hike interest rates. Now, the rand is being affected badly because the US Federal Reserve Bank have been the most aggressive of all countries in hiking interest rates. It's actually not true. Brazil has actually hiked very much as well. Brazil is actually the most aggressive to have been hiking to 13.5% interest rates already. But the US of the major countries have been hiking interest rates, and that attracts money, global liquidity flows to the dollar. And that has been making the dollar very strong, also because the dollar is the least affected by the war in Europe. And so South African rand and a lot of other currencies have been falling simply because of the dollar being strong. But the rand has actually recently been weaker than the others because of our problems with Eskom, that we haven't got enough electricity. And that simply means that, the Eskom problems, that costs of our exports will become more expensive, and that means that we can't compete internationally. Our exports will fall, and that because the country is becoming less competitive and your exports becoming less and less, means there's less money coming back into the country. So the two main reasons are dollar strength and Eskom, just because of what it's doing to growth in South Africa.
You have mentioned the impact that this is going to have, a weaker rand, on exports. What about imports? Because we are net importers of some commodities in South Africa.
Yep. No, very good point. So indeed, in terms of our biggest import is obviously oil. And there we are actually fortunate, as is the rest of the world at the moment. The oil price is coming down. But in other countries, because the currencies have been stronger or not as weak, the benefit is coming through of a lower oil price, where we're still going to, in the end, most would pay more in rand for oil despite a lower oil price because of the currency being weaker. But you're right, other commodities and other imports also will become more expensive. We have one advantage, as have a few other countries like Brazil, like Indonesia, we are food self-sufficient. So we export more food than we import, which means our food inflation has not been as high as in other countries. If you look at, instance, Britain, inflation rate is there running at 14% expected. Europe, US expected to be 8.5, 9, 10. Ours is still slightly below that. Inflation is still below 8 because our food inflation hasn't been as high as those other countries.
Come Thursday, as the Reserve Bank MPC is meeting right now to actually determine what interest rate hike they should impose, what is your take? What should we expect? 50 basis points, 75 basis points?
No, I think they're in a very tough position, as is actually each central bank. And in our case, I don't think the U.S., the Federal Reserve Bank in the U.S. has actually been lax and too slow in hiking interest rates. I don't think we can fault us too much there, but in the end we're dependent on them. But we will have to follow other countries. When all the major other economies are hiking interest rates by 75 basis points, we will have to follow, because the alternative is then the rand weakens even more, because in the end that is what determines your currency, the level of your real interest rates. So unless inflation starts coming down in South Africa, and there's no sign of that yet, we will have to hike 75 basis points and even more. And central banks around the world have actually acknowledged that they will have to hike interest rates to damage demand, they call it, which actually means they actually will hike interest rates until demand for products starts falling away and then prices come down. So we're going to hike interest rates until we have a recession, unless something else dramatically happens and the oil price really falls, or but for the rest we'll get 75 basis points and more interest rate hikes thereafter.
Kokkie Kooyman is a director at Denker Capital, joining us tonight on weaknesses in the rand. Kokkie, thank you very much for your time.